Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. I hope you can hear me okay. Thank you all so much for taking time out of your busy day to join us today. We have a very exciting webinar again with our resident expert, Dr. Gareth Dyke. And this is a topic that many researchers maybe don't think about or don't think about enough, and it's academic branding. And if you don't know us at EDANS, we are a researcher support organization. We've been helping researchers around the world for 25 years. We are based in Japan and China, but we have a network of experts around the world ready to help you to support with your research planning, performing your research, publishing, and promoting. And I work with the EDANS Learning Lab, which is our learning portal where we offer tips and tricks, tools, and all sorts of self-study materials to help you to be more effective and impactful in your research. But the focus today is our expert, Dr. Gareth Dyke. He's going to talk about academic branding and how you can improve your visibility. Dr. Dyke, how are you today?
I'm very well, thank you, Scott. Good day, everybody. Good evening, good morning, good lunchtime, whatever time of day it is for you joining us for our presentation today. So, you know, we're very happy to see so many people from all over the world. And I know, like, you've all attended lots of webinars and you get used to people saying that, but it is actually the case. We do have hundreds of people attending our training, EDANS, the EDANS Learning Lab, from all over the world. So shall we get started? What do you think, Scott? Shall we get moving with our presentation today?
Please, yes. I think it's an interesting topic. I think many people don't think about branding as being associated with researchers or doing research work. Maybe you can tell us a bit about that. I'll be quiet now so you can do your thing.
Scott, we'll be back throughout our presentation today, and as usual with our EDANS training and with our webinars, ladies and gentlemen, it's not just about Scott and me talking, it's about you as well. So over the course of our presentation today, we're going to be launching a number of polls. We're going to be asking you for your opinions about what we're talking about today, and at any time, at any point throughout the presentation, you are able to engage with us and ask us any questions that you may have about our topic today, which is academic branding. Why don't you jump onto the Learning Lab site? That's learning.edans.com. You can find out there about all of the other events, all of the other content that we have at EDANS to help researchers with their writing and with their publishing. And don't worry if you missed this session, or I talk too fast, or there's something that you don't understand in the training today, because everybody who registered for this event will of course get a copy of the presentation at the end of the session today. Everybody will get a certificate of attendance. That's important, I know, for lots of people, and also that all important video recording of me shouting at you for the next 45 minutes. I'm Gareth Dyke. I did my degree and my PhD in the UK. I worked in the United States. I worked in Ireland, and now I work in Hungary. And my publications, my academic brand as a researcher, that is of course what people know about me, what's available about me online, was not very carefully curated. It wasn't very carefully manicured by me over the course of my career. Don't make the same mistakes that I made, is one of the messages of our webinar training today. I'm not an expert in marketing, but I am going to help, I think, with some suggestions as to how you can curate your academic brand. Talk about your papers, talk about your research, and build that online profile so that other researchers, other colleagues around the world know about you and know about your research. Of course, I published some papers in high impact factor journals, but many of them didn't really get all that much attention in the branding of my research as a researcher. Some of the things I published that were a little bit less high profile got more attention, and that's because those were the papers that people ended up talking about. We'll come back to this in quite a lot of detail in this presentation, but to get us started, let's ask you a question to make sure that you're still awake, to make sure that you're still with us. Ladies and gentlemen, what do you usually do when your academic papers get accepted? And be honest, engage with us, please. Please tell us what you really do when your papers get accepted. Do you post about them on social media, Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook? Do you write a blog post about your published findings? Do you do that? We can help you with that if that's something that you need help with. Do you post about your work on academic social networks, things like Researchgate, academia.edu? Those are some of the most well-known academic social networks. Do you email that PDF when you're allowed to, of course, and we'll talk about that again in a bit more detail a little bit later in this presentation? Do you email that PDF to people in your professional network, or do you write a press release with your institution's media team? I see lots of people are getting involved. I mean, it's not just, as I said, about me and about Scott and about us shouting and screaming. We want you to get involved with our presentations today. Scott, are you there? Do you want to come back and talk about the results of our first poll this evening?
Very interesting results. So we see that the most popular ways to disseminate or to promote are to post on academic social networks or posting on social media and emailing PDFs. The less popular ways to disseminate are writing a blog post, only 3%, and only 12% would normally send out a press release. Interesting.
Yeah, which is interesting, and we'll talk about writing press releases and disseminating our research in quite a lot more detail in this webinar today. But here comes the hard sell, ladies and gentlemen. EdAnts does actually offer press release writing services, so that's something that you can get in touch with our team if you're interested in learning more about that or about some of the other services that we offer at the end. And if you stick around with us to the end of our presentation today, there'll be a free gift at the end, so don't forget to stick around until the end. What do most researchers do? This could be me sitting in the hammock. Most researchers, of course, when their papers get accepted, most researchers don't do anything. They sit there, they wait for those citations, those media coverage, that media attention, those phone calls from the radio, from the TV, those posts on social media. Most researchers just wait for that to happen. That's certainly what I did for most of my academic career, and let me tell you from my own experience that it can be a big mistake. If you don't promote your work, if you don't talk about your work, if you don't build that presence, if you don't build that academic brand, by the way, you should be, if possible, doing this from as early as possible in your academic career, then something's going to happen. As P.T. Barnum used to say, nothing. If you don't promote, something will happen, and that's nothing. You won't get the citations that your work deserves. You won't get the attention that your great research deserves. And so academic branding, building that presence around your work, does actually work. And so that's the topic of our presentation today. That's what we're going to spend the next 45 minutes talking about, how you can build that presence, that brand around your academic work. Don't just sit there lying in the hammock, as I always used to do. Get out there and talk about academic branding. What do we mean by this? I know it's all a bit kind of ethereal, it's all a bit loose. What we mean specifically by academic branding is the building of your profile as a researcher. So that could be you as an individual, that could be your research group, that could be your department, but building that branding, building that profile around your research and its positioning with respect to your research field and how that fits in the bigger picture of research generally. You want people around the world, different research groups at different universities, working in the same or different areas, to know about you and know about your research. And I know it can be very daunting, it can be very scary, especially for young researchers putting themselves out there online and starting to talk about themselves in that international context. But this presentation, I hope, will help to some extent to assist you with maximizing your brand as a researcher. So don't forget, if you have any questions, if you have any comments, please put them into the chat at any time. We'll come back at the end. Scott and I will do a Q&A session at the end of our presentation today. So your impact as a researcher, as a writer, as somebody doing, I'm sure, excellent research. You wouldn't be in the position that you're in if your research wasn't fantastic, but often it can be difficult to make sure that you attain the impact that your research deserves. Here's some fun facts about those users, that user group, those people who are going to be using your work, the readers. Did you know that the most important people in the whole publishing process, the whole academic publishing process, are your readers? Fun facts about readers: they don't have much time to read. They want to read academic papers as fast as possible. They get frustrated. People get frustrated. I get frustrated. I'm sure you do as well, if it's difficult to understand the contents of a research article. And by the way, did you know that most of your readers, most of the users, most of the people to whom you will be branding yourself as a researcher are actually not native English speakers? People forget that as well. They assume that most of their work that they write up is going to be read by other people who are native English speakers. So we provide lots of training. Maybe you attended our webinar 2 weeks ago. Maybe you'll join us for other webinars in the future, but we provide lots of writing training, lots of techniques to help people with their English, to keep the English simple and easy to follow, because of course, most of your readers, most of the people to whom you are reaching out and branding, building that presence around your work online, are not going to be native speakers. That's very important. Also to keep in mind, there's about 30,000 papers getting published across the STEM science subjects, so science, technology, engineering, medicine, and mathematics every day. So that adds up to around 2 million papers being published in just individual fields every year. So how can you build that presence? How can you make sure that you're going to stand out? It really is key, because people are getting busier, more and more content's being published online, more and more research in your subject area is coming out all the time. I'm sure you're aware of that. We have like a page, for example, on Researcher app. You can go and have a look at that. We are helping researchers to access content and get around this issue of, where can I find research? Where can I get into the research? On the Learning Lab, learning.edance.com, there's a fantastic journal selection tool as well that you may wish to have a look at. But the key point here is standing out, making sure that you are standing out in the field and that people know about your work. You don't just lie there in the hammock, as I always used to do. You actually get out there and you promote and build that online presence. So just again, to make sure that everyone's still awake, let's launch our second poll in our webinar today. How would you judge the impact of a published paper? And impact is the key word here in this particular slide, in this particular part of the presentation. How do you judge the impact of a published paper? Is it number of citations? Is it the number of downloads? Is it the number of views that that article gets online? Or is it altimetrics? And we'll talk about altimetrics in a minute, but like, what is it that you think is the key way that you would judge the impact of a published paper? Thanks for participating. I can see that great numbers of people are participating. Scott, are you there? Are you going to come back and just give us the results of this poll? Maybe talk a little bit about what you would do, Scott. How do you judge the impact of a published paper? What would you do? What would you do?
Interesting.
To
Maybe like
that?
most, yeah, that's a great question. We've got a couple of results still coming in on the poll. Let's let those last few come in here. I think most of us have voted now. If you can't find the poll, it's on the right-hand side in your control panel there. I think we have most results in now. So let's close the poll. And as expected, 77% of our viewers today mentioned citations. That would have been my guess as well. Maybe I'm thinking in the traditional way. Tell us a bit about that, Gareth.
Well, I mean, it's not surprising because, of course, this is still the #1 way that universities and other academics judge the impact of their research. But as you'll find out, as you're maybe learning from your own institution or from your own national government, as they assess universities and assess research departments, academic impact is something that we think about, but actually impact as a way of looking at academic work is much bigger than that. But I'm not surprised at all to see that 77% of our audience here today, that's hundreds and hundreds of people, said that they would go for the numbers of citations as the main way to judge the impact of a published paper. Very, very interesting. That is, of course, what most academics tend to think about. But let's step back from that for a moment and come with me, if you will, into the mind of a journal editor. What the journal editors, and I work as a journal editor as well as my work with EdAnts and my own research, your perception of impact as an author, a researcher, is actually quite different to the perception of impact of an editor, or maybe somebody from outside your university, somebody on the street, somebody in a cafe, somebody on the bus. They would look at your research in quite a different way. So unsurprisingly to authors, 81% of authors in our survey cared that their papers were read and downloaded and viewed by others. 64% cared that their paper got cited, and look at that, 68% there. Authors, researchers, these days are caring more and more that their work has impact outside academia. Why is that? Why is that perception changing? We'll talk about that in a little bit in a minute. But journal editors, on the other hand, they don't really care too much that the research they publish has much impact outside academia. You can see that the journal editors are responsible for making sure that content published in their journals gets those readers, those citations that we talked about before. So journal editors care that papers get downloaded, they care that papers get cited. It's that 68% that we're seeing increasingly amongst authors that research has societal impact outside academia that's becoming more and more important. So 78% of our surveyed colleagues in this presentation cared about citations, but have you thought as well about what difference your research might be making to the lives of ordinary people outside of your specific subject area? In terms of getting your work into the journals in the first place, though, we train people to think about the message, and that's key. You have to have a clear, effective message with your academic work so that you can get it into those journals in the first place. If editors can't work out your take-home message, they're going to reject your paper without sending it for peer review. You've got to convince those journal editors that your study is of importance as well, because of course they think, if I'm interested in looking at this paper, if the paper contains an interesting message, then my readers are going to be interested as well. So one of the first stages of impact is having a clear message with your academic articles. And really the secret, and this is a secret, which we're passing on to you for the future, for your career. I mean, maybe you already knew this, maybe you didn't already know this, but the secret, the big secret, to getting your paper published in a high impact factor journal is to make sure that your topic, the question that your paper is addressing, is broadly interesting to an international multidisciplinary readership. Perhaps you thought this is obvious, perhaps you already knew this, but you'd be amazed, you'd be surprised, you'd be flabbergasted how many papers get published and you think, why is that interesting? Why is that work really broadly interesting to more than just that very narrow group of people who are working in that particular research area? So as David Hockney is famous for saying, take a step back, you'll see more. Read widely around your subject, check those news sites to see what's hot in science. How are the leaders in your field, those research leaders, those big international colleagues with the big high impact factor publications, how are they pitching their work to the big journals? And of course, you learn from your mistakes. We all make mistakes all the time, but the success in publishing comes from learning from those mistakes and getting your papers into the best journals possible as fast as possible with a decent impact factor. I'm sure that's something that we'll all have questions about at the end of this presentation today. What is an impact factor? What does that actually mean? Journals that have a high reach and a high readership. What do authors want with their papers? We talk to authors all the time at EdAnts. We engage with the research community around the world. Authors, researchers looking for academic impact want speed, reach and readership. They want as many people as possible to be able to access and download their papers, and they want to publish in journals with a decent impact factor. If you're confused, maybe you're wondering where you're going to go with your next research article, which journal are you going to select? We provide a journal selection service at EdAnts, and again, we have on our website, on the Learning Lab, learning.edants.com, a fantastic journal selection tool. It really is the only one that's not already owned by a publishing company. So if you go to our website, you can get impartial advice on the tools section of the site about where it would be good to publish your next paper. It's not owned by a publisher. What do authors want for their papers? And people often ask, in the context of academic impact, how are journal impact factors calculated? So if you didn't know, if this is a question that you've had in the past, or maybe your students have asked in the past, take a screenshot of this slide, because this is a simple explanation of how a journal's impact factor for a given year is calculated. The total number of times articles were cited from this journal during the previous 2 years. That's how it's calculated over the previous 2-year period, divided into the total number of citable articles in the journal during those 2 years. That's how it works. All journals are aiming for high impact factors calculated by Clarivate. We'll talk about that, I'm sure, in our question session at the end, but that's an important piece of information regarding journal impact factors. And of course, researchers, as we saw in our survey, count papers, impact factors. We look at our RH index, whereas our institutions count citations, they look at circulation. But as we'll ask, as we'll go on to talk about in this presentation, in the remainder of our time together today, your research circulation does not necessarily translate to impact. Remember, impact, and I'm going to give you this definition again in a minute, is more than just your impact factor. It's more than just where you get your papers published. That's an important component of your impact, but we call that academic impact. What difference is your work making to the socioeconomics, to the lives of ordinary people? And that's the second piece. That's the second big piece of impact that we encourage you to have a think about. Your research circulation may not necessarily translate to impact. So here's a few pictures that we took. You can see the sources for these here on the slide. Fast Track Impact, you can go to their website if you're interested in learning more, have this great graphic. Helps with academic branding, helps with maximizing our impact as researchers when we think about what we're doing, academic and socioeconomic. So your impact, if somebody asks you in a job interview or next time you go to give a talk at another institution, what's the impact of your research, Dr. McCleary, you can reply by talking not just about your impact factor, but also about the difference, the good that researchers do in the world. I usually think about this in the context of the way that we used to interview PhD students back in the UK. When I worked back in the UK, we would always ask PhD students coming in for job interviews for PhD positions, what is the impact? What difference do you feel that this PhD research will make to the lives of ordinary people? Imagine you've just met somebody on the bus, you've just met somebody in a cafe, they want to talk to you about your research. They ask you about why your research is interesting, what's the impact, what's the reason that you do your research. They're not interested in which journals you're publishing your papers in. They're interested in the second piece of this. They're interested in the socio-economic impact of the work. So very important to think about that, and indeed to ensure that you successfully build your brand and you talk about your research and you ensure impact. Of course, it's important to do that throughout the lifespan of your research projects, not just, as I always used to do, lying in the hammock waiting for the papers to come out and then doing pretty much nothing about generating impact around those papers once they were published. It is more and more important all the time to talk about your research, to know the channels that your colleagues in your research areas are using. Are they mostly on LinkedIn? Are they mostly to be found on Facebook? Are they mostly to be found on Researchgate, for example, so you can start, as we'll talk about now, to build that impact, to build that brand around your research area. So having started to think about doing that, having started to think about talking about your research and considering your research projects as journeys throughout which you talk about what you're doing as the project progresses, not just at the end of the day when the paper gets published, how can you assess your impact? And imagine how great it would be next time you have to write a grant application, or the next time you have to talk about your research in a job interview or in a media interview, let's say, or in a talk, that you had these kinds of numbers available. You could say, hey, my paper that came out 2 months ago has been shared 100 times. My paper that came out last week has been mentioned, clicked, viewed, and downloaded this number of times. Most people know, most researchers know about their citations. Of course, you can find out about those by looking on Google Scholar. You can find out about those by looking on Clarivate. You can get that information relatively easily. Most researchers also know about their press coverage. They know when they've been on TV. They know when they've been talked about in the media. They know that kind of thing. But do you know your downloads, your views, your clicks, your mentions, your shares? Because these are key metrics. If you have a look at fast track impact, if you have a look at the ways that universities and governments are starting to assess academics, these kinds of data, this kind of information shows or can go some way towards demonstrating that your work has more of an impact than just academic impact. So I encourage you, have a look at this graphic. It comes from Kudos. Check them out as well online. You can get more data about your research. So let's have another check to make sure that you're still with us. Ladies and gentlemen, imagine with me, if you will, that you published a paper in 2015 and it's received 36 citations so far. Is this good? What do you think? It's a good number of citations, or it's not a good number of citations? What do you think about that citation rate? We're going to get some votes on this. We're going to get some information in on this. If you need a bit more information, why don't you ask us for it there in the chat box? Like, what is this question actually asking? You published a paper in 2015. It's received 36 citations so far. Is this any good? How are we doing, Scott? Are you still with us? Are we going to look at the results of this, our third poll in our webinar today? How are we doing? Everything okay?
Yes, results are coming in. We've got most people voting now. 71% of the vote is in. So far, most people seem to think this is a good number of citations. We've got 81% of people responding said, yes, 36 is a good number for this paper. Let's close the poll now.
Let's have a look. Yeah, brilliant. So yeah, I mean, I would actually be quite happy, I think, if I got that 36 citations over the course of maybe a 4, 5, 6 year period. I think that's pretty good. Like you published a paper and it got cited 36 times. But what about if that was a paper on, let's say, a transmittable virus passing between humans and animals, and you'd only got 36 citations over the last 7 years? Given what's happened in the world over the last year or so, then if I gave you that additional information, I bet you wouldn't say that 36 citations was a good number. You'd be expecting far more if you'd been publishing on, human retroviruses, for example, that transmit between humans and animals as long ago as 7 years ago, and you only got 36 citations. I think that you'd be thinking, hey, I should have gotten a lot more citations than that. It's about context, and it's important to know about how your work fits into the context of your research area. So when you get citations, when you get information about your research, when you get that kind of data, those kinds of data, we also encourage you to go and have a look at your field specific metrics. Go and see like what other researchers in your area are also getting around their citations, because of course 36 citations in 7 years is actually quite meaningless unless you have some comparable information about your particular research area that you can compare to, that you can think about, that you can then use to demonstrate your impact. Hey, if you're working in a particularly hot research area, such as the example that I gave, transmittable viruses between humans and animals, you would potentially be expecting a great deal more citations for your work in order to demonstrate impact. And this is, I think, perhaps the most important slide that we will show you in our presentation today. Impact, assessing impact, developing a brand around your research is actually a journey rather than something that happens at the end of the process. So we give you this, again, it comes from Fast Track Impact. Maybe this kind of diagram, maybe this kind of graphic would be useful for you the next time you have to put together a grant application, the next time you have to demonstrate your research in a public talk or give some kind of workout of your research. Impact as a journey. What inputs, what activities, what outputs, outcomes, and impacts is your research having over time? And so you can see that some of the impacts activities that you could collect, that you can count up and put into your spreadsheets, into your notebooks as a way of assessing your impact are quite obvious. Your facilities, your equipment, your funding, your collaborations, but some others are not so. In terms of future impact in particular, cultural, economic, environmental, health, political, scientific, social, technology, and training. Don't forget that all of this information can be used to build that story around your research, build out that impact as a journey in your own career. Very important not to just do what I always used to do, and that's nothing. Celebrate your successes as an academic. Your papers get accepted. That's a great thing. Most people actually, when we talk to researchers around the world, most people, when their papers get accepted, they think, oh, thank heavens for that. It's been such an ordeal to get the paper through the peer review process. I'm finally there with the acceptance. It's a big relief. Most people actually have quite negative feelings towards their final publications because they think, oh, it's just been a big nightmare. Finally, the paper has been accepted. Take some time to celebrate your successes. This is very important, not just psychologically, but also because it puts you in that right mindset to then start to talk more about what your research might mean, to talk about it and build that brand around it. Don't just sit there and wait for people to find your work. Promote your work. Talk about your work. At international conferences, I know that these are mostly online these days, and maybe they will be for a number of months to come, but we can help you with those kinds of skills, how you can successfully communicate about your research in an online setting such as this one, how you can talk about your work on social media. And we'll come back in a minute and talk about press releases and how we can help you to do that after your papers get published. The writing of press releases, putting the work out on social media, very obvious, but the point here is that you don't want to just sit there and wait for people, as I always used to do, to find your work. The importance of attending conferences online, of course, as we just mentioned, cannot really be overemphasized because you get the chance to promote your published article. You get the chance to identify those new trends in your research field, and perhaps most importantly of all, network, building your brand, building that sense of the fact that you're a researcher, that you're doing great work, that other people are going to know about you. That's the networking part of all of this. And I know, we all know it's been very difficult to do this year. How can you network with colleagues internationally when you can't meet them face to face? I think we've all learned a lot about how this can be done successfully in online settings. We've certainly learned a lot about how we can network successfully online. Again, if you'd like to get more training in these areas, networking, promoting, finding research topics for you or for your research group, then do get in touch with us at EDANCE, at the Learning Lab, because we can help. We provide training, we provide courses, content to help you promote, network. Do you know how to give a successful talk in an online setting? Identify new trends. So we are here to help. Get in touch with Scott, get in touch with me, get in touch with our other colleagues, and we will help you with this aspect of your research promotion, building that brand around you as a researcher. And of course, one of the best ways to increase the reach and the citations that you get when you publish work is, of course, to collaborate. Collaborate. If I publish 10 papers on my own, 10 papers that are just Gareth Dyke papers, then only the people in my own professional network, even if I promote those articles, are gonna necessarily have the opportunity to discover my work. But if you collaborate, if you work with other people, let's say you publish 10 papers with 4, 5, 6, maybe many more co-authors, and remember that all of those co-authors have to also have contributed significantly to the study. Authorship is an issue. We can discuss that at the end, but then of course your work will be shared within the networks of much larger groups of people. In most fields, less collaboration was associated with significantly less citation impact. So one of the key ways you can help yourself is, of course, to collaborate. Altimetrics can tell you about your articles. Those are the little colored wheels we see next to papers. This is a data science company that tracks where published research is mentioned online. It provides tools and services to institutions. So you can see here in this example, it's a paper published in 2020, March 2020, so just over a year ago. You can see that when it was published, that little colored wheel tells you that it's appeared already 1,036 times online. And you can track down there on the left-hand side of the slide to have a look at where news outlets, blogs, tweets, Facebook pages, and videos. This is a great tool. Have a look at this. If your journals that you're publishing in are linked to the Altimetrics tool, this is a great way for you to build that impact and discover where your papers are getting cited and getting used by others, because the Altimetrics tool is looking at public policy documents, the mainstream media, 9,000 blogs, Wikipedia, social media, readers on Mendeley, the Open Syllabus Project, that's syllabi from more than 4,000 institutions worldwide. It's a great way for you to find out what's happening with your research after publication. And of course, we've talked about this already. Share your work, talk about your work, build that impact using academic social networks. This is one great way to disseminate, build an international reputation, and of course, build your CV online without much work. So who has a Researchgate account? Here you can see mine on Researchgate. Don't forget, of course, that you're not allowed on these social networking sites to put published PDFs of your work up until after that journal embargo period has ended. If you have questions about this, we're here to help with that as well. You can see some of the embargo periods for different publishers here on this slide, but you can, of course, put up that last draft, that Word document, that PDF that you submitted to the journal before it got accepted. You can put that kind of content anywhere you like online. So understanding the impact of your research is important. And as we've mentioned, your impact is your academic publications plus the difference that your work makes to society. It's all an important component of branding. You can think about this in a journey format. You can think about this in a wheel format, as shown here, your inputs, outputs, outcomes, impact, and what happens with your research out there in the real world. This presentation is full of checklists. It's full of useful content that I hope you will have the chance to look at in the future and maybe use in your research development in the future. So let's have a look at some options as we launch our fourth poll in our presentation today. Which of these options do you think is best in terms of impact? Which of these will be best in terms of impact? If you publish one paper in the top 1% and 4 papers in the top 20% within your field over the course of a period of time, or if you publish 3 papers in the top 1% and 1 paper in the top 20%, or what about 2 papers in the top 1%, 2 papers in the top 20%? What's more important to you in terms of your impact? What do you think is the best option for you as a researcher? I think that we'll hand over quickly to Scott to see how we're doing with the poll. How are we doing? What kinds of returns are we getting with this poll?
Oh, yeah.
It's interesting.
Thanks, Gareth. Yeah, this question is a thinker. I can see people spending a little extra time thinking about their responses. That's great. We try to put the difficult questions towards the end. Looks like we've got 57% of people voting in. Let's close the poll soon in a couple of moments here. If you haven't voted yet, please cast your vote in the poll. I'm going to close the poll in just a moment.
Yeah, so I mean, I know what I would say in terms of looking at impact and making sure that my work has the maximum impact. Obviously, it would be better potentially to get more papers published in the top 1% within your field and not worry so much about how many papers you're publishing that are hitting that top 20%. And so that's why almost half of our audience today have gone for the second option, where we're going for those larger numbers of papers that are getting into the top 1%. And I think that's important. That's what we all potentially want as researchers, that peer group recognition. So brilliant. Okay, so I'll jump on, we'll have a look at what's coming up as we now start to talk about promotion. And don't forget that when your work gets published, you can, of course, promote it in a press release in the traditional way, of course, and you can work with your press office. You can work with your university to write a press release if you feel that your work is newsworthy. If you don't have an office, if you don't have people at your institution to help you with this kind of thing, then did you know that we have this service at Edance? You can get in touch with us. We can help you write that press release to give that correct information from you, the researcher, out to the media. These are important, of course, because your increased visibility leads to increased downloads and citations. As we talked about before, researchers, we have that responsibility to educate the public about our research. Why is that, I hear you ask? Why can't I just plow my furrow, do my research, and not worry about the difference that my work is making to the lives of ordinary people? Often, almost always, the work that we do is funded by the public, by a public endeavor. People give tax money, the government gives that tax money back to us, the researchers. So we actually have a key responsibility to provide understandable information back to the public about our research. That's the whole field of science communication, SciComm. Maybe you've heard of it, maybe you engage in it, and maybe you use it as a technique to build your research. So we monitor, we measure our impact as researchers Using tools like Google Scholar, this is also a great way for us to look at our impact online. You can see here quickly your citations, your H-index, what's happening with your papers as individual pieces of work. And let me also, as you build that brand, as you think about your online presence as a researcher, if you haven't got an Orcid ID, perhaps you should get one. This is a great free tool connecting research and researchers that enables you to distinguish yourself in 3 easy steps. What's the point, I hear you ask? Well, if I go and I search for common last names in particular countries, Smith, Jones in the UK, maybe Zhao in China, for example, you'll get, even within particular subject areas, hundreds of hits. So make sure you are distinguishable. I published in my career papers using G-Dyke, published papers using Gareth Dyke, published papers using G.J. Dyke, published papers using Gareth J. Dyke, and that makes it much harder for people to identify my work online. It's a great innovation, the Orcid IDs. You can sign up for one and you see them often now in published work, as we see here, those little green ID badges that appear on the authorship list. And indeed, many journals, increasing numbers of journals and publishers, are not letting you make a submission even if you don't have that Orcid ID. So thank you for listening. That brings us to the end of our training presentation today. Scott's going to jump back in, I know, in just a moment. We've talked about developing that online presence. We've talked about your impact as a researcher. And the key thing to take away from this is, of course, that your impact, how you can measure your impact, it's not just the journals that you publish your papers in. It's about what difference, what is the impact in terms of socioeconomics, what difference is your research making to the lives of ordinary people. If you don't know the EDANCE Learning Lab, here's the link. Get in touch with us. We have lots of content on learning.edance.com that we know will help you with your writing, your publishing, and your journey. Thank you so much for listening. And now, of course, we have time for questions. I said at the beginning of this presentation that we'd be coming back with a free gift. Stick around, we'll be giving you that in a moment. But Scott, have we got any questions from our presentation today? How are we doing?
Yes, Gareth, we do. We've got some great questions today. We'll try to get to all of them. So thanks to everyone for posting your questions. And if for some reason we don't answer your question today, feel free to reach out to us. You can see, you can find us here at the Learning Lab at edance.com email address. You can visit us on Learning Lab. There's a contact form there. Feel free to reach out to us if we didn't get to your question today. So let's try to get to some of these here, Gareth. I've got a question from a Ms. or Mr. or Dr. Kadir, and the question is, most of the time we see that high impact factor journals have a huge APC, the article processing charge. Okay, how can it be possible to publish, or maybe how is it possible to publish in a high impact factor journal while paying a nominal APC? Or how do we avoid those kinds of big charges?
Great question, and it's a very common question. Article processing charges, of course, APCs, are becoming standard in certain kinds of journals. So in open access journals, that's the way that the publishers are making money from the publishing process. So of course, high impact factor open access journals tend to have higher article processing charges. For example, if you want to publish, if you're lucky enough to get one of your papers published in Nature, it's not a full open access journal, it's what's called a hybrid open access journal. You can pay $10,000, I know, to get your paper published fully open access and online. It's a lot of money. I know that some of the big medical journals that are fully open access also have high fees, but there are still many journals out there with great impact factors that are published in the traditional way. So published by publishing companies, sold back to libraries and institutions, but placed behind a paywall. This is the big trade-off that we face as academics in publishing these days. You can find journals with good impact factors in your subject area where there's no article processing charge. Have a look at the tools. On the Learning Lab, learning.edance.com, the tools, we have a journal selection tool. I mentioned it earlier on in this presentation. It's great. And, you know, I just began working with Edance, and I can tell you from my own experience as a researcher that the journal selection tool is absolutely fantastic. So that's one way that you can find a journal that doesn't have a high APC with a decent impact factor where you can publish your paper. And also, if you're going to publish in an open access journal where there is an APC, write to the editors. Tell them maybe you're from a country where they have an agreement. Maybe there's an agreement between that publisher and your country. India is one example where that's often the case. Or you come from a country that's in the developing list. So there's often you know, ways to reduce or completely eliminate the price of these APCs. But get in touch with us, we can help with that as well. Slightly rambling answer, but I hope it was helpful. And thank you very much for the question. Thank you so much for it.
Yeah, great question. Here's another question for Gareth. This question is, I'm sorry if I'm saying the name incorrectly, it's Neslihan. And the question is, well, first comment, thank you for your great presentation. Thank you for attending. How can we improve the visibility of the article published in 2015? Oh, okay, it's a great question. This goes back to our poll question. So looking back at that article, is it too late for this research anymore to promote it?
Well, it's never too late to promote your research, and that is a great question, absolutely. It's just that maybe you can't write a press release, you can't get the work covered like on the front page of the New York Times because it was published 7 years ago, so it's not like up to the minute, it's not newsworthy, and that's something that's important to think about when promoting your research as well. But you certainly can do a number of things to increase its circulation amongst researchers in your field so that they will cite it. One way would be to just email it to lots of people who work in your research area, put it on a website, maybe get it talked about on one of the key social networking sites that researchers in your field use. Or what about writing a review paper where you cite that paper? That would be another way to increase its circulation. We can help with that actually as well. We provide review paper writing services. So if you need help coming up with an idea for your next review paper, Edance can help with that as well. But yeah, I would say get it out there. Make sure that as many people who may want to cite that paper know about it. So increase its circulation, email it, talk about it online, put it on those social networking sites, get it into the faces of people who work in your research area who may not know about its existence. Great question though. Thank you so much for it. Wonderful. We're getting some great engagement from our presentation today. Really very good. Thank you, Seth.
Great questions today. Thank you, Gareth. Let's get to a couple more questions here. Here's a question from Nikita. And Nikita says, I'm a new researcher and I still haven't settled on a niche area. However, I have published a review on coronavirus therapy very recently. Is there anything that will help me increase my citations since I have published on a comparatively new hypothesis which has gotten a positive response in a few pilot studies? Very timely question.
Absolutely, that's a great question. Without wishing to push our Edance Learning Lab content too much in our webinar today, we did actually publish several blog articles quite recently about how to increase the citations of papers that have already been published. So one of the best, or I would say that something you could do is to jump on over to our YouTube channel or have a look at the Edance learning.edance.com site where there is an article that gives you 12 steps that you can follow to increase your article citation now that the paper has been published. But again, my answer to this specific question, quite similar to the one that we just discussed, increase its circulation. Do everything you can to get it out there. Email it to people working in the field. I think there's nothing wrong with that at all, especially for young researchers. We encourage you to build that academic network, build that group of people who know about you around the world. So email it out to colleagues who may not be aware of its existence. So yeah, great question. Good luck with that. Good luck with finding your research area. Again, like if you need help, we're always here to provide that. Thank you for the question. Thank you.
Thanks for the question, Nikita, and thanks, Gareth, for your answer. I put the link to Gareth's video in the chat box here, so feel free to check that out. So many great questions here. Let's go to a question from Ahmed. And Ahmed asks, how do I know the embargo period of my research? Do I get it from each journal individually, or is there some collective website where you can check that?
Yeah, this is a great question, and it's very important because lots of researchers are unaware of these nuts and bolts, like the mechanics of the publishing industry. And when you publish a paper with a traditional publisher, it's different with open access articles, of course, because you often retain that copyright yourself in open access publishing. But if you publish in a traditional way, often the publisher takes the copyright. I know you're thinking, I did the work, I own that, but that's just the way that the publishing industry works, fortunately or unfortunately. So you need to check with your journal. Check with the journal, go on the journal website, have a look at that publisher, because often those publishers will provide you with specific information. And so in our presentation today, when you get the recording, you can skip back and have a look at the table earlier in the presentation, where you can see the different embargo periods for the 4 big publishers, Wiley, Springer Nature, Elsevier, Taylor and Francis, and they are around 6 months to a year. So that's usually the embargo period, but be careful and check, especially with Elsevier journals, because Elsevier, each journal often has its own specific embargo period. It can be different in HSS journals, humanities and social science journals, to the STEM examples that we provided today. You can't put that content on a publicly accessible website until the embargo period has passed. But thank you very much for the question. I hope that helps. Thank you.
Great question. So many good questions here. Here's a question asked actually by several of our guests today, and it's about Researchgate. So both Anthony and Pacorn had a similar question. And basically the question is, we mentioned Researchgate in the presentation today, but what are some other social media? And do you have any recommendations for sharing and promoting your work besides Researchgate?
My favorite place to share and promote my own research is on LinkedIn these days. And I know that in different areas, different regions, different parts of the world, people have different preferences as to where they put their research. Facebook, LinkedIn, academia.edu, for example. But PubSure is another one you can have a look at. But it's important to put it in as many places as possible. So hi, Anthony, thanks for the question. Yes, I would say that increasing numbers of academics around the world are actually using LinkedIn, which many people thought or used to think was really just a place for business people to meet and for companies to do lots of networking, but it's becoming much more like a social networking site these days. So that's a good place, a good example of a place where I see lots of research papers shared by both academics within their networks and by publishers who want to highlight great content that they've recently had the chance to publish. But yeah, thanks for that question. I'm a big fan of Researchgate. That's why I highlighted that in this presentation today. But thanks for the question. Thanks a lot.
Excellent question, and thanks for your answer, Gareth. Do you have time for a couple more questions, Gareth?
Absolutely, yeah,
Sure.
of course.
Okay, great. Here's another excellent question. This is from Guliz. I hope I'm saying it correctly. And the question is, during press release, what is the most important issue in the context of scientific ethics? when doing press releases?
Yes, it's a very, very good question.
Question.
So if you're doing research that involves an ethical question or that has involved some kind of, let's say, maybe an institutional review board approval or ethical approval, I would say that you should mention that in the press release, because of course it will be the case that if the press release gets picked up by the newspapers, by the press, by the media services, like many, many, many more people are going to read the press release or what results from the press release than will read your original article. That's, of course, how most members of the public who we're trying to reach out to with our research to show socioeconomic impact, that's where most members of the public will engage with your work. Most people don't check the primary literature, they don't read Nature news, they don't look at science news online, for example. So be very careful, I would say, to put that information into the press release. And I think that we've all seen examples recently throughout this pandemic period of research that we've seen covered in the media, and we haven't learned some of those key pieces of ethical information. So your responsibility as a researcher, part of that responsibility is to make sure that people are aware of what you did, how you did it, and why that work was done and how it was approved, how it was possible for you to run that drug test or that trial on those people. And we have questions, don't we, about things that are relevant to us. I mean, I'm thinking of the Russian vaccine, Sputnik 5, as I give this presentation. Very limited information is available about the clinical trials for that particular vaccine. I have lots of friends that have taken it, but they would like to know more about what it is that they've been injected with. So I think that that could be on the researchers to provide that kind of information. Thank you for the great question. Yeah, some great questions we've had today. I think it's been really interesting. So,
How about time for one more, Gareth, or shall we close the polls? Okay, we've got another great question here. It relates to your previous answer. We'll make Gareth work a little overtime today. Sorry, Gareth. And by the way, for all of you who asked fantastic questions, if we didn't get to your question, we're very sorry, and we'll look for your question in our email inbox. So feel free to reach out to the email address that you see below, or you can use our contact form on the Learning Lab site as well. We look forward to seeing your questions there. One more question here today. This is from Leah, and it relates to the answer we gave earlier, which is about promotions. And Leah's question is, I'm a bit worried about privacy issues related to sites like LinkedIn and Researchgate, as anyone can access your profile. So which of these gives more control to the user to control who sees their profile?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, you can control that. Like you can control that on all of these sites. You just have to do a bit of tinkering, a bit of fiddling with the site itself, because of course the default option for all of these will be for everybody to be able to see your profile. But you can go into LinkedIn, for example, have a look in the settings, and you can control there like who can see your profile. You can set it so that only people that you're connected with already can see your profile, can see your posts, and it's the same on Researchgate. You just have to take a little bit of time to go in and tinker with the settings on the site, because as I mentioned, like the default for all of these social networks, Facebook, LinkedIn, everywhere, is that everybody can see everything, and often that's not what you want. I do get that, I understand that, and for you as a researcher, you may wish to control like who can see your posts. So sharing only with people who are already in your network, allowing only people that you can verify. And one way that you can do that on these sites is by asking people to provide an email address before you accept that they're going to get connected to you. But yeah, that's another great question. Thank you. And thanks everybody for all the questions. Let me again encourage you to jump onto the Learning Lab site, because many of the questions, Scott and I have been doing this for years. We're getting old, as you can see, and many of the questions that we get asked in these training sessions are questions that we've been asked before. Sometimes they're not, but often they are. And so we write about those questions. We put blog content, we put videos on YouTube to answer those kinds of questions. So if your question hasn't been answered by us today, you may very well find that it already has been on the Learning Lab site. So have a look at that Learning Lab site. And if you want to sign up for all the access on there, we've got lots of great courses, e-content, training courses, only $30 for a subscription for a whole year. A whole year. I know, it's crazy. We're giving it away. And so if you want, sign up on the Learning Lab. Indeed, if you're an academic, a researcher, a university academic, maybe a dean or a university president listening to this today, we can do you a deal for your institution. So get in touch with Scott and I at the end if that's of interest to you as well.
Thanks very much, Gareth, and thanks everyone for joining today. And again, if we didn't get to your question, we'd be happy to hear from you. Please send us a message and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. And thank you all so much for taking time out of your busy day to join us today. And thank you, Gareth. Thank you very much, as always.
I have a free gift, and I'm not going to give it to you now, but if you check your email after the presentation today, we'll follow up, of course, with certificates. We'll follow up, of course, with recordings. We'll follow up, of course, with the PowerPoint. We'll follow up, of course, with a survey so we can ask your opinion. Maybe you've got some ideas for the presentations that you'd like to see us give in the future. The free gift is going to be a discount code in your email that you can enter into the EdAnts website, 10% off all of our products and services. So make sure you don't miss that. Make sure you check your spam settings so that you get those EdAnts emails without any problems. Thanks again for listening. Thanks to my colleague Scott for his excellent comparing of these sessions, and we'll see you again soon, right?